The film Nimona is a fun animated tale from Netflix Studios all about a modern-day knight who is framed for the murder of the queen. In order to clear his name, he tag teams with Nimona, a shapeshifter who's been ostracized and called a monster due to her abilities. As I watched Nimona be a crazy nutjob causing chaos and transforming into a dancing pink shark, my boyfriend leaned over and said, "It you!" At which I laughed and agreed, like, totally me, right? Then later in the movie, when Nimona tries to transform into different creatures only to be then rejected by every single one of them, and is never allowed to be fully herself. Oh no. It me. So, with Nimona joining the likes of Black Mirror's episode Nosedive, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and The Little Mermaid as accidental autism representation that I watched while breaking into drunken sobs, I thought to myself, why can't movies and TV shows actually show autism? Is it asking too much for us to be written like normal people? And for a while, I really thought that this was all we were going to get. Accidental representation that's afraid to say the word autism and actually show what autism feels like from a humanizing perspective. And then I got invited to a screening for the movie Ezra. Ezra is a film currently in theaters at the time of this recording that follows up-and-coming stand-up comic Max, played by Bobby Cannavale, and his experience as a father to his autistic son Ezra, played by William A. Fitzgerald. Max and Ezra go on a road trip together, along which come quirky characters played by Vera Farmiga and Rainn Wilson. We also see glimpses of other members of Max and Ezra's family, such as Ezra's mother, played by Rose Byrne, and Max's father, played by Robert De Niro. Though the premise sounds like something we've seen in so many films with autism as a subject, this film is actually a little bit different. This one is, dare I say it, good? But before we get into the video, let me just say hi there! If you're new here, my name is Rebecca Ricky Faith Quinn. I am an autism advocate and crisis counselor for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. I make videos about neurodivergency and feminism in media, and even though all of that sounds super smart, I am in fact an autistic bimbo. All beauty and no brains. Or in autistic language, all beauty and no trains. If you'd like to join me in the bimbo community here, you can join our Patreon, which is linked below, and receive early access to videos, script, and even a Patreon members only podcast. You could also join me live as I record these videos. Say hi everyone, we are live. If you can't contribute to the Patreon, don't worry, subscribing to the YouTube channel is completely free, and there's even a little bell button that gets very sad when you don't press it. Look at him, he's got little tears and everything. Only you can make the bell button happy. And now it's time for our disclaimers. First off, Ezra, the film we are going to be talking about, is currently in theaters at the time of this video's filming, and as such, we don't really have much footage from it to use. That's the bad news. The good news is that my Batfish Insane video editor decided to recreate the scene with his Legos, which I think he intended as a joke, but since I'm a basshole, I'm gonna kill my script editor! Since I'm a basshole and I pay him, I thought it would be hilarious. So, shark you, James! On a more serious note, this film does deal with things such as child abuse, and though none is shown, there will be discussions about it both in this film and in this video. Also, from a behind-the-scenes aspect, Robert De Niro has made some very anti-vax comments in the past, and even funded a documentary called Vaxxed that was supposed to start the conversation about vaccines and autism. The conversation was started, Robert. It's been started, Bob. It's been started for a while, Bobbert.
Talking to me?
Vaccines don't cause autism. There has only ever been one scientist who found any evidence suggesting there was a correlation between vaccines and autism, and he lost his license for that study because he not only cherry-picked his data, but he was also spreading this misinformation in order to make money off of his own vaccine alternative. Oh, and he was basically torturing autistic children for shark's sake. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, being autistic is better than dying of the measles, or any other preventable with vaccines, illnesses, and diseases. Can't believe I even have to say that. I know Bobbert here made the documentary because his own autistic child's autism just appeared overnight, but it didn't. We don't currently know what causes autism, but we do know that genetics play a huge part, and that autism develops in the womb. People are born autistic. It was always there, they just didn't know it. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get into why Ezra is actually, for once, a good autism movie. I've said it before, gotten lots of hate comments, will continue to say it because I'm a glutton for punishment, and here I am saying it again. Autistic characters should be played by autistic actors only. And this film sharking gets it. The titular character Ezra is an autistic boy somewhere around 12-ish years old, though his age is never officially stated in the film, who's played by actually autistic actor William A. Fitzgerald in his feature film debut. When it comes to casting child actors, I usually give a bit more grace on my rule of casting autistic characters, not because I don't hold steadfast to my morals, but because, as we've seen in documentaries like Quiet on Set, something that we covered here on this channel, the world of child acting can be really dangerous and slimy. Add in being an autistic child actor with the accommodations needed to make the filming process safe, and I'm a little more understanding as to why an autistic performer might not have been chosen. I disagree with it, but I don't criticize it as harshly because I think it's shrimpy to give carp to a child actor that don't really have a choice in who they play. Shrimpy. But the casting department for Ezra knew that authentic casting was so important for the role, and they went the extra mile to make sure that they cast an autistic performer while also giving him opportunities to have the script revised if he wasn't able to do something due to his sensory issues. An example of this is a moment in the film where Ezra and Max find their way to a horse farm, and Ezra is supposed to have this magical moment of connecting with the horse where, according to the script, Ezra was supposed to breathe into the horse's nostrils with the horse doing the same to him, thus connecting them forever. According to William, he did not want to touch the horse due to sensory issues, and he especially did not want to breathe into the horse's nostrils out of fear that the horse would sneeze on him. In an attempt to alleviate William's fears about the horse sneezing, director Tony Goldwyn opted to demonstrate the action himself to show William that the horse was trained and that nothing would happen. Tony performed the breathing action, and the horse sneezed all over his face. William then apparently shouted, "Peace out," and then ran across the field away from the horse. After that hilarious moment, Tony asked the screenwriter to adjust the scene to Ezra having a moment of eye contact with the horse instead, which allowed them to separately film William and the horse in such a way that it appeared as though William was standing right next to it, even though he wasn't. This was a moment on set where they not only made a very easy change to accommodate their disabled performer, but they actually, in my opinion anyway, improved the film. Eye contact is a difficult thing for autistic people to perform, so engaging in eye contact with an animal makes for a very powerful and impactful experience. I'm aware that accommodations can't always be made for every disability, but in many cases, making the accommodation can lead to a better project overall. This film went above and beyond in ensuring that an autistic person was able to perform the part of an autistic person. But the question is that enough to make the film not ableist? Sia's 2021 film Music was an excruciating disaster that honestly would not have been saved from its ableism even if Maddie Ziegler's character had been played by an autistic performer. Well? Nope, you did not misread that title card. This film is not ableist. Is there ableism in the story? Yes, because even in fictional media, autistic people can't escape ableism. But having ableism in the film is not the same as the film itself being ableist. The biggest difference between a film that has ableism and an ableist film is the framing. The question is, does the film point to the ableism and say this is wrong, or does the narrative try to justify it? In the case of Ezra, no. Okay, well, sort of. Max clearly has a lot of ableism towards his son's autism diagnosis. Max constantly makes comments about how Ezra shouldn't go to a disabled school for disabled children in a way that clearly implies he thinks Ezra going to that school would somehow make him lesser. This is ableism, point blank period. But the film implies several times that it comes from a place of internalized ableism due to Max's own upbringing by his father Stan. Throughout the course of the film, Stan, Jenna, who is Ezra's mother, and even Max himself make inferences that much of the things that Ezra does due to his autism are things that Max also did during his own childhood. Shell, Jenna even states at one point that she thinks Ezra inherited his autism from Max. There was a point where I thought that this film was going to go a little bit on the everyone's a little autistic direction, but it instead turned the exact opposite direction and made a point that no, not everyone is autistic. Just most of the men in this family, with the vast majority of them remaining undiagnosed, mostly due to the cycle of abuse, but more on that later. The film treats Max's constant corrections of Ezra's autism traits as a character flaw, something that actively hurts the relationship between father and son. But unlike in some other films about disability, this isn't portrayed as something that Ezra needs to fix, rather Max is the one that needs to change. It's made clear that Ezra isn't going to suddenly stop being autistic. His sensory needs may change as he gets older and he may experience new things on his own time, but Ezra is always going to have sensory issues, and Max is the one responsible for accepting that Ezra's autism is not going anywhere. And Max does accept it. Much of what Max experiences is something that I think a lot of parents of autistic children have experienced. Many times when I've spoken to parents of newly diagnosed autistic children, they've often found colloquial ways of referring to their child's autism, whether it's as superpowers or a different ability or a difference, basically anything that lets them avoid saying that their child is disabled. This does come from a place of ableism because a lot of parents think that having a disabled child means that their child is somehow broken. And if your child is broken, then it's your responsibility as the parent to fix them. And if you can't fix them, then it almost feels like you somehow failed as a parent. Parents want their child to have the easiest life possible, and being disabled is never easy. So accepting that your child is not going to have the easiest life is one of the scariest things a parent can do, especially if they're not experienced with autism. This film manages to show a sympathetic view of Max's fears, even though they do stem from ableism, and I do appreciate that they don't frame him as a bad father. Yes, he makes some very bad decisions, like please do not ever assault your child's doctor, and if you do that anyways, please don't break the restraining order and kidnap your kid, no matter how much you love them. But Max's bad decisions come from a place of love, not hatred, and also an inability to behave responsibly in like any situation anywhere. But also love. Do I think that every parent of an autistic child is like this? No, absolutely not, or at least I hope not. Child services would be wasting so much time and money if they were. But I do think that many parents of autistic children have felt like this before. Max demonstrates those feelings of fear that a lot of parents have for their disabled children, and even though his feelings do come from an ableist place, I don't think that's a negative thing, mostly because... Remember how I said we were going to be talking about child abuse? This is where we start talking about child abuse. So if you are not okay with discussing that, I'm going to have my editor put a time card on screen for you to skip to. Don't worry, you won't insult me by doing so. I am a pre-recorded video who has no feelings. In the emotional climax of the film, after a minor car accident, Ezra has an elopement that causes him to run into the woods, naturally scaring the crap out of Max. Ezra comes back immediately, but Max reprimands him for doing something so dangerous as to run away from a car accident. Autistics who have had elopements after an incident of getting hit by a car, raise your hand. Please raise your hand. I can't be the only one. Damn, I really cannot be trusted to be alone with myself. I should call Bimbo Protective Services. Also, people inordinately worried about accidentally getting lost in the wilderness and feeling justified in this moment, raise your hand. Oh, just the script editor? Well, shark you, Julie. Max repeatedly asks Ezra to look him in the eye, something that Ezra says he does not feel comfortable doing, and after Max pushes Ezra to do it anyways, Ezra expresses frustration that Max never listens to him and asks what's the point of teaching Ezra how to communicate his needs if those needs are just going to be ignored by Max anyways. Max realizes that he needs to let his anger out and cool and asks Ezra to wait in the now broken car before Max calls his father Stan and confides that he almost had an emotional outburst that would have resulted in him physically punishing Ezra. Stan tells Max that under no circumstances should he put hands on Ezra, and Stan laments that his biggest mistake in life was using physical punishment on Max during his childhood because of Max's own unusual tendencies. And let me tell you, this really hit home for me. Not to overshare on the internet once more, but I also experienced physical punishment as a child because of my autistic traits. Growing up in the 90s, corporal punishment was widely accepted as a necessary part of raising kids, so much so that I think a lot of us 90s kids struggle to name it for what it actually was. Child abuse. We were abused as kids, and I think that what scares us about naming it as such is because if we were abused as children, then our parents are child abusers. And at this day and age, we always want to hunt for the abuser and send them off to Abuser Island. And while some people definitely deserve to go off to Abuser Island and get yeeted into the sun to be forgotten forever, looking at you, J.K. Rowling, like shark you, Joe. But I do think that there are some people who commit acts of abuse that can be forgiven, especially because most people who become abusers do so after being abused themselves. This is what we call the cycle of child abuse, not to be confused with the cycle of abuse. The cycle of abuse is often discussed in survivor spaces and here on this channel when discussing domestic violence, and though the patterns of the cycle of abuse often exist within child abuse, the cycle of child abuse is itself a different perspective on abuse. The cycle of child abuse discusses the intergenerational transmission of abusive behaviors, where those who were abused or neglected as children become more likely to perpetuate that same treatment onto their own children, thus continuing the cyclical nature of behaviors that are in fact harmful. Now, there are a selection of people that argue, well, I was hit as a child and I turned out just fine. And if you are that person, I want to ask you some questions. When you make a mistake, how do you handle it? Do you have a punishment mindset or an accountability mindset? Do you feel like you can form safe and secure attachments with your loved ones? What does your self-esteem look like? Can you look at yourself in the mirror and honestly say you love yourself? Have you experienced domestic violence after your experience of being hit as a child? These are many side effects that can come from corporal punishment or spanking a child. And for autistic children who are spanked, it can also lead to skill regression and increased risk for PTSD, communication regression, and so much more. As someone who was spanked for my autistic traits, watching this film acknowledge that spanking is wrong, that it can cause harm, that there are better and healthier ways to parent your children, and seeing the characters discussing how to emotionally regulate yourself when triggered to the point where you might perpetuate that abuse, seeing that discussion really and truly healed something for me. It addressed the subject matter in a nuanced and direct way that I haven't seen in other films. Take, for instance, the film Music, where the physical abuse of an autistic person, the prone restraint, is not only used in the film, but it's normalized and, dare I say, even justified, as they call it, crushing you with love. Or, for a slightly better example, the film What's Eating Gilbert Grape. There are several scenes in that film in which the character of Arnie, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, develops trauma surrounding bath time, and the character of Gilbert, played by Johnny Depp, is unable to regulate himself and lashes out to the point of further traumatizing and physically abusing Arnie, despite it being clear that Arnie, a disabled person, is being a disabled person. Though What's Eating Gilbert Grape does in fact frame Gilbert's actions as something wrong and something that Gilbert feels terribly guilty about, it never fully addresses the effects that Gilbert's actions can have on a disabled person's development, nor does it address where that kind of abuse comes from or how to prevent it in the future. What's Eating Gilbert Grape was considered extremely progressive for its time, but in my opinion, it's failed to hold up to the test of time. I expect, however, that the message in the film Ezra will hold up. Ezra is nuanced. It doesn't punish the character of Max for his feelings, it holds him accountable, and it addresses the root cause of Max's mindset. The film even takes it one step further, with Stan apologizing to Max for the ways in which Stan didn't accept Max's childhood behaviors. Stan also acknowledges the way in which he has unintentionally caused the same sort of pain for his grandson as well. Laying out the cycle of child abuse in such a subtly expressive way and allowing for true accountability really opens up the conversation to how to heal and move on from the trauma of it. Can some abusers be forgiven for not having the tools to break the cycle? Of course they can, but that requires an acknowledgement of what the harm was, an apology from the person who perpetuated it, and a demonstration of true accountability, which means establishing an action plan to make sure that the harm is never caused again, which again the film does by having Max acknowledge that Ezra's autism and his autistic traits are not going anywhere. In order to fully accept that, Max has to allow Ezra to be himself and go to a school with other kids who may understand him in ways that non-autistic children just don't. I think this film managed to very aptly show the acceptance journey that some parents of autistic kids have to go on, and I think it did it in such a good way because when I compare Ezra to films like Music, which arguably are very similar in structure, down to both having an autistic person experience meltdowns and elopements as a highlighted portion of the film, having the autistic character have almost magical connections with specific animals, having a non-autistic child be the autistic character's spiritual guide through the world, and even having the titular autistic character not be the main character and instead focusing the story on an abrasive and sometimes abusive caretaker of the autistic person. The major difference between Ezra and Music, aside from the framing of abuse as we discussed earlier, was also the level of involvement from the community. When Sia first released the trailer for her film Music, she said that it was a film for the community. Then when the community said, hey, this film is actually kind of abusive and not really great for the autism community, she then said, psych, this film was actually not for the community, but for the community of caretakers, not autistic people themselves. Ezra feels like the creators saw Music and said, let's not. Damn near everyone involved with Ezra was either a parent of an autistic person, which, as a reminder, parents of autistic people are a part of the community too, or an autistic person themselves, such as producer Alex Plank, who was so directly involved with the production that he was on set much of the time to make sure that the needs of a young autistic actor, William A. Fitzgerald, were being accommodated for. Also, Alex Plank's service dog was apparently a big help in regulating not only Alex, but William as well, so good job, service doggo. Having an autistic producer on the set goes an extra mile in ways that shows like Atypical tried but failed to do in only having an autistic consultant involved, which really only affects the writing process and not the filming process. For once, Ezra was a movie that was about us that wasn't without us, and that's something that honestly makes me so mad. Looking back at the media I had before I was diagnosed as autistic and the media I had after I was diagnosed, there wasn't a lot that made me feel okay about being autistic. The message from a lot of that media was the same. Your struggles are the only thing people notice about you. They make things harder for everyone else, and it's your burden to bear. The only real solace I found was in characters that felt like me but were never actually explicitly stated to be like me. Characters like Anya from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Cordelia from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Willow from Buffy the okay, maybe everyone in that show was autistic coded. But there were a lot of characters in the media with which I grew up that were autistic coded but never fully allowed to be autistic. Kind of like how I was never fully allowed to be autistic, or Nimona was never fully allowed to be a shapeshifter. And now, people who are being diagnosed as autistic are getting shows like Everything's Gonna Be Okay, or Heartbreak High, or films like Ezra, which highlight that, yeah, being autistic can be hard, but we're people who have problems. People problems. The fact that all of these projects are including autistic people both in front and behind the camera leads to more nuanced takes about the autism experience and the experience of family members of autistic people. It's so nice to see the improvements in autism films, even down to Rose Byrne being in a much better autism movie than Adam. Shameless plug for a previous video. And I dare say that Ezra even challenges previously held views by members of the cast, like Robert De Niro, by emphasizing the genetic components of autism instead of just saying it appeared out of nowhere. Autism had to come from somewhere, Bobbert! Growing up, I had good accidental autism representation, with the intentional autism representation being harmful. Kids nowadays will have good intentional representations that says, hey, I see you. And in so many ways, it's thanks to autistic performers and activists in the industry who have worked hard to assert that we are here, we can make art, and we are going to make art that we wish we had. It actually reminds me a lot of the quote from the Barbie movie. We mothers stand still so that our daughters can see how far they've come. My generation may not have gotten the autism movie we wish we'd had, but the next generation will. And that makes a world of a difference. Hello, if you have made it this far, it is time for our meme break and our Patreon shout out. So I decided to do it at the end of the video because I couldn't really find a good place to stop halfway through. But here we go, meme break, Patreon shout out. So these memes were brought to us by the Patreon member whom we are shouting out today, Sam. That looks like me. Okay, listen, I would take a selfie in the middle of a shark, okay? And this is also me, it's shark dancing. Beep, 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 beep. Wait, I think I actually have a blanket like that. Hold on, let me see if I can get it. My knee. I grabbed the small one. Help. I'm stuck. Sam, thank you so much for being a member of the Patreon, and thank you for the amazing memes. If you would like to consider joining our Patreon and being our next Patreon shoutout member, go ahead and join our Patreon. The link is down below. And send me all the memes. I've been in the worst depression of my life. I could use the memes. Thank you. Until then, I can't wait to see you guys in the next video. Bye!